Hello, and welcome to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. I'm John Agroni. I'm a published fantasy author with over 10 years of experience as a professional writer and editor. And on this podcast, I'm here to try to help all of you beginner fantasy writers or maybe barbarian fantasy writers get the kind of tips and insights you might be looking for when it comes to honing your craft, writing a story or a novel or a novella, whatever it might be, whatever the length and whatever the kinds of themes and ideas you have going on. I want this podcast to be a resource for you. We are a listener-supported show, so what that means is we rely on the thoughts and opinions and advice prompts of fantasy writers, maybe like you. And so one of the ways that you can help us put on an even better show is to let us know if you have something you are curious about. Email us anytime, fantasywritingforbarbarians@gmail.com, or consider joining our Discord. It's the In Between Drafts Discord. That is our website and podcast host website that you can also check out. And it doesn't just have fantasy writing stuff in it. It has other stuff too, like anime, movies, books, TV, games, music. It really is pretty endless. We even have a whole channel dedicated to the Pizza Wars, determining the best pizza chains in the United States. Yes, we are that strange. But wherever you're at in your writing journey, my goal too is that I never claim to be an expert on anything. I am an enthusiast. I have a passion for the fantasy genre. I love writing fantasy, reading fantasy, watching fantasy, everything fantasy. And so one of the things I like to do when I'm working on fantasy for my own kind of purposes is I always try to remember why I love this genre in the first place, what it is that draws me to fantasy, and how I can continue to hone my voice as a fantasy author. And I hope that's one of your goals too. I think that if nothing else, even if you write a book and you feel like, the book didn't work out, maybe you did your best. It's happened to me. And you worked really hard on something and it didn't turn out the way you hoped, or you weren't able to find the readers that you wanted, or whatever it is. I always try to lean back, though, on whether or not I was able to improve my writing voice. Because if I'm able to get just a little better at my voice as an author, that is a tremendous effort, right? I never like the advice, just write, because I think writing and writing without purpose or intentional, sort of focused, intent to circle around what I'm trying to say. I feel like if I just write for the sake of it and I'm not really writing in a way that is, constructive and is a reflection of things I'm actively learning, then, there's not much going on there. But I think honing your voice and getting better at your voice is one of the nice byproducts of working hard on a novel and applying the things that you're learning. And so my challenge to you is, if you're working on something, or if you're not sure what your goals should be in terms of, what does success look like for you after you finish the one draft or, 2 or 3 drafts, I would definitely, I would love it if you considered how is my voice as an author going to improve? What does it mean to have a voice? Maybe we'll do a whole episode one of these days if Natalia sends us a prompt about author voice. I think that could be really fun. We'll put a pin on that though, because we do have a writing prompt that Natalia has sent over that I don't know what it's about yet. Hey, if it turned out to be about writing voices, that'd be pretty amazing, but I doubt it. Statistically, that is very unlikely. But yes, if this is your first time listening to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians, what we do here on the show is one of our wonderful producers, Natalia Emmons, sends me a prompt, a writing advice prompt, and that I have not seen yet. I'm going to read it for the first time on air and react to it and give my advice, and then read some of the comments on that prompt and maybe kind of see what other people had to say as well, since it is just me. And then at the end of the show, I send this right over to our other producer, Bridget Surdock, and Bridget's going to make sure that I covered all my bases. If I said anything wrong, correct me and all that good stuff. And then we'll finish out the show at that point. Okay, so let's get into today's advice prompt. This comes to us from the Fantasy Writers subreddit on reddit.com. Username Jack Monsoon. So I'm just going to call them Jack. I like that. Sounds like a fantasy name, Jack. And Jack writes, "What are your stories for how you determined your novel's title?" Oh, fantastic. I love talking about titles. So this is going to be fun. I think we've dabbled a little bit on titles when it comes to this podcast. usually when I have walked through sort of the kind of writer's checklist sort of advice in terms of what to do before you start drafting, having like a working title, that sort of thing. But I haven't talked too much about titles, I don't recall. But here is what Jack has to say. Here's the rest of their question. Was it a quote you wrote from in your story? Did you determine your title early on in your writing process, or did it suddenly hit you during your book's peak moment? Does it foreshadow anything in your main plot arc? Were you ever advised by an agent or editor to revise it to something different? Did you publish under a title and have any regrets about not choosing something different, etc., etc.? I always find the thought behind these determinations interesting and love hearing how other writers came up with theirs. I've been very slowly writing my first novel, and I still have yet to determine it. I'm thinking it'll hit me at some point once I get further in, but curious if hearing your experiences will spark something. So this should be a lot of fun. So it's generally somebody reaching out and wanting to hear stories of how people are coming up with their titles. I think that's a very fun way to kind of, if you're hitting a wall too and you're like, I don't know what to name this thing, just listening to how other people come up with their titles, that can be an inspiring kind of way to maybe reset and, take a break from the brainstorming, right? And just, or not even brainstorming because it's something you're doing on your own, but, take a break from, staring at your computer screen and maybe look at another computer screen that's people telling their stories about how they came up with their titles. So I'll answer the question, of course, on how I typically come up with my titles. And then I want to read some of these folks too. And remember, we always link to these prompts in the show notes. The email address is in there too. So if you want to read along and you want to read it, because there's a bunch of these, so I'm not going to read every single one. But for sure, you can follow along and check out the prompt linked there. But all right, so the first part of the question, right? It's like how, the stories, how you determine your novel's title. I can get into this a little bit. I've had easier times with some titles than others. My most recent novel was much easier, but compared to the other ones. And the interesting thing about fantasy too is that fantasy titles tend to follow some different rules and expectations compared to titles in kind of other types, like other genres, particularly literary. And so what I mean is take a book like Catcher in the Rye. So Catcher in the Rye is going to be something that, the name of that novel is more about the themes. It's more sort of about the main character and what their deal is, what's their perspective. But then if you look at a book like The Chronicles of Narnia, which is fantasy, of course, that is specifically like two words there that evoke an actual fantasy setting. So Narnia, of course, but Chronicles. So the idea of like not just the stories of Narnia or, the tales of Narnia even, but Chronicles. So that is just kind of like, it's trying to take what makes this whimsical and escapist, this kind of fancy sort of word, Narnia, and intrigue, and using, that kind of thing to evoke, something fantasy related. And you could also look, of course, at fantasy novels that use the character names. If you have a like unique character name, then that can be very helpful. I mean, like Harry Potter, right? But also it's always like Harry Potter and the big fantasy thing. And also, like things like Mistborn, right? So like Mistborn and the Final Empire, but Mistborn in particular is a name that is referring to not like the main character, like what the main character is, but this kind of intriguing sort of classification of the character. In terms of like how I've named my stuff, and one thing that I've always tried to avoid is naming books the way that like a lot of the successful books have done it. So there's a very overused fantasy style of names that gets made fun of a lot these days. It gets memed quite a bit, which is a blank of blank and blank. So a court of thorns and roses, a song of ice and fire. There are so many novels that kind of follow this formatting. And so the idea is that these are long books and they're fantasy, and they typically like use these kinds of simple words and to evoke, a kind of larger thing. So look, like a Court of Thorn and Roses doesn't really have, like a big fancy fantasy word in it, but because it's longer and because it's flowery, it kind of evokes fantasy in a different way. And so, that's very different from if you take like Percy Jackson, and that's using something more relatable, but it's like Percy Jackson and the Olympians. That's something that is now being seen a little bit more as the kind of not lighthearted, but a little bit more like a middle grade / YA, versus something like Court of Thorns and Roses is supposed to be like high fantasy YA, I guess. I forget exactly if people consider Court of Thorns and Roses YA. I mean, I do, but I don't know what people are saying in other places. But anyway, for my books, I try to keep things simple. I like one-word titles. I don't do them as much as I used to, but my first couple of fantasy novels were one-word titles because I wanted to challenge myself a little bit. I remember my first fantasy novel, I originally called it Origin Story. And that was because I wanted it to feel like an origin story. And the idea of the book was you didn't know whose origin story it was. It was a multi-POV. Ultimately, though, this was an example of like after I had finished the book and I was working on it with an editor. I literally was like, all right, so we're going to publish this book. And I remember being really conflicted because I knew the second book was going to be called Killer Joy. And the idea of Killer Joy was going to be like this thing that gets revealed at the end of the first book. But then I just remember like the editor and I were talking about like, what are we going to name the whole series? Because I hadn't come up with a name for the series at that point. And they were a little bit concerned because they were like, are people really going to get it? And we were this was around the same time we were working on the cover. And I remember just sitting down and being like, you know what? Like Killer Joy is such a good title. I should probably just name the first book Killer Joy, and Origin Story could just be like the name of the overall series. Now, I think ultimately we just ended up calling it the Killer Joy series, even though we never got to release the second book because of COVID and the publisher went out of business. But that is a sad story. But I wanted it. I remember being like, yeah, one word title. That's fun. And Killer Joy kind of evoked that kind of fantasy thing. It was a little bit more in the style of something like Dune, like that kind of like naming, like keeping it simple. Honestly, something short and punchy. Versus, with fantasy, you typically are going to have stuff that's more descriptive. But I don't care. I was like, my kind of fantasy isn't like the typical high fantasy, so I was okay with bucking that. But of course, it was a bit of an experimental risk. The second book, which we didn't get to release, it was finished and it was in the process of being edited. We had the cover. It was called Vanguard. It still exists out there. I still have the rights to it and everything. But yeah, one of these days I might be able to just self-publish it once I decided to commit to that series again, because then I would have to finish the third book. I never did. Anyway, so that's how I did it with my first couple of books. So the book that I did after that was fantasy. So I'm skipping nonfiction stuff, but the second book that I never ended up publishing it, but I am in the midst of, so I'm actually about to go back and fix it and hopefully publish it. This one was so much harder in terms of the title. I kept changing the title. I kept going back and forth. I was very indecisive, quite honestly. I kept having like names that I just knew that I liked, but I knew wouldn't work. But I wouldn't get rid of. And it was honestly representative of, I think, the core issues I had with the book itself and why I struggled with publishing it in the first go around. And that was because it's a book that I just kept shifting too much. And so I would change the title to go with it. And I never had that North Star. I never really quite had like I think it's the kind of book that I landed on something that was more of a thematic sort of title, but and it was a little bit more descriptive, a little bit more like it wasn't the blank of blank of blank, but it was. I think at one point we landed on I at one point had it as New Machina, and I felt like then I was like, well, New Machina isn't going to work because there were like 5 reasons, even though New Machina was the most sort of like it really stood out. But then I started to pitch it under The Voice of All Storms, and that's how it kind of landed for a while. But as I go back to fix it, I'm like, no, that's not it either. So it's actually going to be changing yet again. But anyway, that's a thing for another time. My most recent book was the easiest book I've ever titled. Easiest. And one of the reasons is because I had a great foundation for that book. I knew, like I had a title for it in the very early go-arounds, like when I was first working on it. And it was not that different from what the current title is. It's just, it was a little bit too stiff. It was just kind of like a placeholder title, and I knew it would be. I never pitched it under that title. It was when I was in, I think, my second revision that I realized what the title was, and it stuck. And it never had any reason to change. I was like, yep, this is it. And so I can't wait for that book to eventually get out there because I think that it's very special. But that one, in terms of like how it happened, I would say that that one was just a matter of sitting down and writing a bunch of names and being like, it could be any of these. And, my honestly, for that one, I came to it when I was in the shower, as many of these things do. Every time I take a shower, I do not waste shower time. Shower time is where my best ideas come. And it's honestly because no technology, it's just the shower, just cleaning up. And, a little TMI, I'm sorry. But honestly, like I use that time to come up with scenes. I use that to like think about my stories and to play things out in my head. And it's even better than when I'm driving because I'm not distracted, right? I'm not trying to focus on the road. But in terms of like just that cleansing sort of like shower experience, that's when I thought of it. I was like, oh, what if it was this, And I was like, yeah, that's the title. And it just sort of stuck. Sometimes when you have the right title, it is just going to stick. And when I was pitching the book, I got a lot of positive responses back. I got a lot of agent interest for it. Still haven't gotten it to a publisher yet. But in terms of, the title, I've never faced any resistance to it. People really like the title and find it to be fitting. And that's not something I'm used to. I'm used to a little bit more pushback. So that was definitely that was a cool moment. I was like, oh, so I can title things well sometimes. But anyway, in terms of like when it comes, it's up to you. I think that having a title makes it feel real, even if it's a working title, and you just can't force it. Sometimes the right title is going to come along. And if it doesn't feel right, it doesn't feel right. And I think for me, it's like once I settle on the title and I know it's right, nothing could shift it at a certain point. And if you feel like it can still shift, and I've been in that boat too, obviously, as I was saying before, then yeah, that's definitely a sign that maybe the title, you just need to wait for that moment when it's going to hit. And sometimes people can help. One thing that hasn't helped me with titles is like I've had people who like read my stuff and give me awesome feedback. Bridget, of course, is one of those folks. And, it's tough to like give a list of titles. People be like, which one do you like? I used to do that and I don't really do it anymore. Bridget has always been very helpful and supportive of that sort of thing, just because I think they're very realistic and, they always have like pretty good feedback, good comments on like, okay, yeah, so, here are some pros and cons. Although I think they definitely loved the most recent one because I don't think they had any pushback on that one, as I was saying before. But anyway, so that's my story on at least some of my recent titles. I've had other ones along in the years that I could get into as well, but they're not as interesting. Let's see what some other folks had to say here. So this is from username Attacula. They wrote, usually has something to do with the major themes or events in the story. Yeah, it's tough though. When you choose a thematic title in fantasy, again, it can feel a little flat. And I think the industry is moving sort of away from that sort of thing. Like, Children of Blood and Bone. I like that book. It's a fun book. I don't love it, but it's good. And I don't love the title, Shadow of Blood and Bone. I don't know. It's just starting to feel kind of generic, like this technique of if it has blood and bone and, ash and, books that I like, don't get me wrong. But I think we're moving closer to like shorter titles, a little punchier. Fourth Wing, we're getting into the 2-word titles again. So Fourth Wing, Divine Rivals, Ruthless Vows, these kinds of books that are more evocative with the simple words, but they feel a little bit more like, I don't know, like they have a little bit more weight because they don't, they aren't trying to go that hard. I like stuff like the Bone Shard Daughter. Like that's kind of cool. Like that's like a different, like, oh, what's a Bone Shard? I don't even know if I'm saying the name of that book right, but I hope I am. But I one of my favorite fantasy novels I've read recently, The Twice Sold Soul, this idea of selling your soul to a demon. And, that's just like, it's simple, but I feel like it's not trying to shortcut, a fantasy concept. It is just a twist on something that you probably have heard before. I like titles like that a lot. I think that they tend to do their job. They function well. They're distinctive, but they don't stand out so much that they feel like they insist upon themselves as a title and it's distracting at a certain point. And I think thematic titles, I feel like literary just kind of has the market on that. I feel like thematic titles, they kind of scream literary and they scream to some people, maybe wrongly, kind of stuffy, pretentious, a little inaccessible. And even if that's not the case, yeah, unfortunately, there are a lot of readers who see that and are kind of like, oh, then I probably won't like this. So you don't want that to happen. But other books, sometimes it's a mystical thing. You could take a 2-word book like the, Basilisk Throne, and that's kind of a stuffy, pretentious fantasy. a fantasy that I like, to be clear. But it's not a super fluffy title, but it's also, I don't know, there's something about it. It has kind of the appeal of both at the same time. I could not tell you why. It's kind of an intangible thing. All right, so Hit Squad of God wrote, it's a 3 men walk into a bar joke, at least for the working title. Helps set the setting and tone real well, too. Oh, so that's kind of fun. So, like, they're taking an idiom, right, or a reference point, and using that to just kind of, like, at least for them, they're saying a working title, establish a tone, which is really fun, especially when you do that with fantasy. We are seeing, like, cozy fantasies, for example, are using a little bit of humor to kind of be like, hey, by the way, this is a cozy fantasy novel. It's called Legends and Lattes. So, like, that kind of tells you, oh, this is going to be kind of cheeky, right? Or, the house, the Cerulean Sea, like, that feels calming. Your title should kind of have an effect that matches the tone of the novel, right? So, for me, like, Killer Joy, that was a novel that was, like, very, like, action, adventure, like, a lot of crazy stuff happens. But there's a little bit of joy too, I guess. And, I don't want to reveal the name of the most recent book because I don't want to, because I feel like it could happen. I could be doing stuff with it pretty soon. But, my other novel, New Machina, I wanted that to evoke something kind of stoic, kind of like this BioShock kind of feel. Like, that was something that I wanted to get across. And one of the reasons that stopped working is because I started to shift the way the story's tone works and it didn't really match anymore. But anyway. So that's a pretty fun one. Plastic Care 7632 writes, the current fantasy epic I'm drafting, the series as a whole that is, was originally titled A Chronicle of Morn, being titled after the main character's home, which then evolved into A Requiem of the Morn. After some rigorous renaming procedures and is symbolic of some major themes I'm playing with for the ending. Yeah, so this one is kind of similar to the Chronicles of Narnia. So, yeah, taking a simple word and kind of putting a more fantasy-geared word in there. It's something that, tends to work. I think one thing that you want to make sure you're doing because it's hard to get away with this kind of title just because you want the book to be memorable. And if you are talking about the novel to someone, you want it to be easy. Like, if someone's telling you about the novel, you want it to be easy for them to find it. And so, like, it's different if you're texting somebody. But if you're talking to somebody in real life and you're like, oh, it's called A Requiem of the Morn, they might spell it wrong and then they can't find it. It doesn't always happen, but it's one of those things to, you want it to evoke curiosity. Sometimes it can be tough to do that with like a made up word. Sometimes people just kind of like see the made up word and their brain immediately puts its guard up and it's like, word I don't know. So other people though will be like, oh, that's cool. No, Morn, no, I wonder what that is. And then they'll read it. So you never know. Joy Mass author writes, for The Castle That Moves in the Night, the title came before the story. So they wrote a book called The Castle That Moves in the Night. That's a fun title. For The Memory Folk, I was on draft 3 or 4 several years in before I realized what the name should be. It's not a term from the novel, but it's a parallel construction to common terms in the novel and matches the story and themes. I think that's very fun to kind of take something that isn't even brought up in the whole book, but to kind of like evoke it just for the title. It can feel a little bit like a bait and switch, but I think, again, like Memory Folk, it's one word. And I personally would be a little disappointed if I was like, oh, this never kind of shows up in the novel. I wonder why. But as long as, if the novel's working in every other level, then I guess you're okay. The Castle That Moves in the Night. I mean, not just, immediately I'm like, okay, so a castle, so probably medieval kind of fantasy, but also moves in the night. So probably a little bit of horror, supernatural stuff. Boom. That's a title. And I like titles like this too, where it's like, the thing that does something. That kind of construction is, it's definitely done a lot. It's not like it's underused, but it's not so overdone that I think people will immediately be like, this kind of title. So that's pretty good. I think this person, the Joy Mass author, I'm curious if I've ever seen them before, like if they're a pretty well-known writer at some point. I'll have to look that up. And then we have something here from Big Commission 4911 who writes, I thought the word lament was cool and fit the vibes, so I wanted to use it. Thought of what could come after, like lament of this, that, etc. My story has a big motif of predation in its world and theme, so I thought of Lament of the Predator. Then I realized that this title was super, super good because the idea of the predator lamenting the killing of its prey is super central to the story's themes, thus, Lament of the Predator. Yeah, that's a pretty cool title, and I think it's much better than Lament by itself. One thing that I didn't even get into, but very important for a title, is I always look up if somebody else has used the title before. And so this is a big reason why I think that it's a big thing that people tend to overlook. You don't want a book that has this, like a title that's been done over and over again. It's sad. I've for that second book or third book I was telling you about, one of the reasons I kept messing up with it was because the title that I really wanted to use, I couldn't because so many other people had used it. I was so sad because I remember looking at it. I was like, how have other people used this title? It's so specific, but so many people had. Yeah. And so that was really sad to me. But yeah, you want to make sure that your title, that is a big determination. And I think that this person, yeah, they found a pretty cool title. This is why I struggle a little bit too with like talking about titles, because I don't want people to like even accidentally steal one of my titles. But so that's why I've talked about books that they couldn't steal at this point. It's too late. Or, it doesn't matter if they steal it because I'm not going to use it. Okay, we'll do one more. This is from Thomas Fowler II, and we've seen stuff from this person before. So they're responding specifically to the OPs when they said, like, in terms of like, what's your story? Was it a quote you wrote from in your story? And Thomas Fowler wrote, no, I come up with the title either first or else leave it untitled until a later date. And only one, The 9 Laws of Power, is a title mentioned overtly in the story, but in that case, the title came before the story. And then, did you determine your title early on in your writing process, or did it suddenly hit you during your book's peak moment? Usually I start with a working title, which I typically change later on. And then in response to, does it foreshadow anything in your main plot arc? They said, I mean, it's relevant, but not really. To be candid, my main purpose is to come up with a title that's as striking as possible as to its implications. The 9 Laws of Power is one I like, for instance, because it has a bunch of implied questions. What are the laws? How are they learned? Who teaches them? Who uses or misuses them? And so on. Were you ever advised by an agent or editor to revise it to something different? I've never published and don't have an agent. And then, yeah, they're just saying, like, not applicable to the rest of the stuff. Yeah, so, the 9 Laws of Power, yeah, the idea of, like, it reminds me of iRobot. Yeah, I think when you do titles that are a little bit longer, too, like this one, like 5 words, not a bad thing necessarily, but I do think that for me, I struggle with, like, the untitled. I always want to have, like, a title. Even if I know I'm not going to go with it, it just makes the book feel weird, sometimes, or real. And sometimes I use a title I know isn't the right title. Or I try to come up with one that's like ridiculous on purpose. Because again, I want it to have like some kind of identity as I'm going in. I do think that it's good advice to not sweat the title, to not overthink it. A lot of the time, the right title is not going to come until pretty late in the process. And that's okay, right? You do want to have a working title, something functional, and ideally something great when you are pitching to an agent and especially a publisher. Because if you don't have the title figured out, that's a big red flag. And I think that it's something that agents and editors, they don't want to fight you on. They just want it to be figured out. They want this to be more seamless. So you want to put a lot of work in the title when the right time comes. But a lot of the time, you're not going to know what the title is until you know. And for most people, I shouldn't even say for most, for many authors, it's just something that comes either like halfway through the book and on when they feel like the right title sticks. But, sometimes it sticks like early, like first few chapters, maybe even like when you're writing your pitch paragraph before you even start drafting. That's how some of this stuff sometimes the right title just insists upon itself. But all right, so I'm going to leave it there and turn it over to Bridget Surdock to see if they have any fact checking for this. I don't think I said anything too egregious, but of course they'll let me know if I messed up here. But fun to read these. Lots of cool stories that people put in the comments. There's a bunch of other comments here of people telling their stories that you can check out in the show notes description. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to Bridget for fact checking and then be back in a second. So don't go away. And we're back. All right. So now I'm taking a look here at some of Bridget's notes. Very excited to see what they had to say. So Bridget writes here, don't know if I have much to say for this one. Okay. I have such a hard time picking titles. And, they also commented, God, I forgot Killer Joy used to be called Origin Story. Yeah, for context, for those of you who didn't really know me back in the day, Killer Joy, that came out 2017. So yeah, I was working on that back in 2016 is when I was drafting that novel. And yeah, for the longest time, it was called Origin Story. And Bridget made a comment that they do love the title of my most recent book, which I'm not going to say out loud here because I'm always careful about these things. I try to be at least. Bridget wrote, the trend of fantasy novel titles from lengthy descriptive titles to punchy one-word titles feels like the shift of Disney movie titles over the years. Yeah, so like movies like Tangled, I think was one of the first ones that really did something with that. I mean, I know there was like Bolt or whatever. But yeah, we've seen that, like Tangled, Frozen, and then even something like, I guess, Moana, even though it's the name of a character. It's more like Mulan. But yeah, it's interesting because Disney did have like the name titles, right? So Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, Snow White, literally the first one. And then they kind of transitioned into the short, punchy ones. It's something that Pixar did, I think, a little bit more, right? With things like Up and Coco. Well, I guess Coco is another one. It's a name. That's like the most common, I guess, way to do it. Bridget wrote, I don't know if you already looked into it since recording, but for the audience, it doesn't appear the Joy Mouse author published either Memory Folk or The Castle That Moves in the Night. Yeah, I looked into this right after, and it looks like they wrote these novels, but it doesn't look like they published them. And so, good luck. I hope they're able to. It sounds pretty fun. And yeah, I would definitely be interested to see how their publishing career is going, if they've got something in the works. Bridget wrote, a lot of what I've written, I've only ever given working titles because I didn't want to worry too much about the title if I didn't finish the thing. And lo and behold, I haven't finished the thing. Well, Bridget, I think you will eventually. For Dungeons & Dragons, it's a little different because this isn't going out into the world, it's just for my players. So I can be as silly as I want to be with it, or I can steal someone else's title, either on purpose or on accident. Honestly, my opinion, I think that being silly with a title, honestly, sometimes like it just sticks, even if it feels silly, and it's like, it's almost like a good idea to be like, what would be the silliest title, and kind of go from there. And sometimes it can be the best title, quite honestly. The one shot I just did with my cousins for Thanksgiving, I just called The Elusian Job. It was a heist, and they were stealing from the Elusians, a noble family who was evil. Another one shot I ran that turned into a full campaign was The Blight of Bowerton. The town was called Bowerton, and there was a blight on the crops, and players had to figure out what started it. Yeah, so these don't feel like working titles to me as much, but I guess that's what the point is. It's like it's Dungeons & Dragons, so you want it to be a little bit more descriptive. And yeah, that could be a helpful frame of reference, actually, for folks who are trying to just come up with a working title, or maybe they just want to have a functional title that gets the job done. And Dungeons & Dragons is kind of a decent way to start that conversation in your head about. Bridget wrote, I have an idea for a different one-shot called Necropolis Noir, which is a murder mystery set in a city full of necromancers. Oh my gosh, that sounds amazing. Especially with necromancers, murder. Yeah, that's unique. For all of these, I came up with the titles as I wrote them, as I figured out the themes and the general concept. Alliteration is always fun and way easier to get away with in a medium like Dungeons & Dragons. Also, none of them felt perfect by any measure, nor did I really want them to. They just had to get the correct vibe across so my players knew how to approach each one. It also makes it pretty clear in the title what their mission is before we even start. Yeah, I like that Bridget talks about vibes here. And sometimes vibes really do a lot of the work. And I think that is maybe that intangible feeling I was talking about, where if a title feels off for some reason, it might not be that it's necessarily a bad title, but it just doesn't have the right vibe to it for whatever reason. And you got to listen to the vibes. You got to make sure, you got to give everything a vibe check is what I'm trying to say. Bridget wrote, the one last thing I would like to add is that naming a one-shot or a novel, or what have you, is not all that different from naming a kid. Sometimes you know immediately what you're going to pick before you even know you're pregnant. Sometimes you think you know until you say the name aloud for the first time and change your mind. Or, in the case of my parents, you'll have had a name picked out for the entire pregnancy, and then once you're in labor, one of you will turn to the other and say, I don't know if we should name our son that. It's a hard name to carry. And you change it, quite literally, at the last minute. I've always, in my novels, paid a lot of attention to names. Names are a consistent theme I like to put in my stories because we don't pick our names. And yet, your name, for a lot of folks, really shapes your identity. It shapes how you express yourself. It shapes how people treat you and talk to you. And so names kind of fascinate me for that. It's just one of those things that for a lot of people, it's out of their control. So the idea of changing your name, or, back to Killer Joy, one of the main themes in Killer Joy is using the concept of that, like a name, and people who will dress up in a costume as like some kind of superhero. That is really what I wanted to tackle in that story. And which is why the name is called Killer Joy, because that ties into that exact concept. So all that to say, I think that, with titles, it can feel a little bit sometimes like your book is your kid. So I see what Bridget's cooking up here. I think that's a a fair point, and sometimes you want the book to name itself, or you want to leave space for when the book is ready to go and you're looking at it and be like, well, is this really the right name? Is my book going to resent me years down the road and put me in a nursing home if I don't name it correctly? Who knows? I don't want that to happen to me. But all right, thank you so much, Bridget Surdock, for your wonderful comments and making sure we got everything on the up and up. If you have any other questions, listeners, about titling your novels, anything specific to, always feel free to reach out to us and get some personal advice or direct from me, and we'll be sure to help you out with that, of course. All you have to do is email us, fantasywritingforbarbarians@gmail.com. All the emails go straight to our producer, Natalia Emmons, and I only read them if she sends them to me so we can save stuff for an episode and I can read it off the cuff and for the first time and all that good stuff. But thank you, of course, to everybody who listens to the show, and thank you so much to the person who wrote the prompt here that inspired today's topic, and of course, thank you to our wonderful producers, Bridget and Natalia, for all that they do. We'll be back pretty soon, of course, to talk more fantasy writing, but in the meantime, be sure to keep on writing if that's what you feel like doing.